Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. One morning in Venice, with the salty wind from the lagoon brushing your face, you feel someone step in beside you. You turn, and it's Marco Polo. If you're truly curious, he says, don't just look at the map, listen to the road. And then together, we begin crossing a continent. This isn't a fairy tale. We're going to follow the grain of lived reality. The tar smell of ports, the thick walls of caravanserais, the thirst of the Iranian plateau, the way your breath shortens in the Pamirs, how water becomes more precious than gold at the oases along the edge of the Taklamakan, how Mongol order speeds the roads in the Gansu corridor, and in China, how paper money turns into trust in the planned avenues of Khanbalik, how grain on the Grand Canal keeps an empire fed, how Hangzhou keeps flowing even after dark. Then we'll go to sea. On Sumatra, we'll learn what it means to wait for the monsoon winds. In the Indian Ocean, as we carry the fate of a princess, we'll realize we're carrying our own fate too. And at the very end, when we return home to faces that say, "You're exaggerating," we'll understand why details are sometimes the only proof we have. If you're ready, let's step onto that road together. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. I truly need your support to keep this series going. Chapter 1. From Venice to the Gate of the Desert. The morning we stepped down to the quay in Venice, the salt of the lagoon hung in the air. Marco Polo stood with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo. Crates were counted one by one, seals checked, lists reviewed, and you were there with us. Marco leaned in and said, "The road is long, but what's longer is people's memory. Every city asks who you are before it lets you pass." He showed you a small pouch, letters of recommendation, permissions, gift, inventories. As we descended into the eastern Mediterranean, the language of the ports changed. In Acre, beneath the shadow of the walls, two worlds pressed together. On one side, the hard order of fortresses. On the other, the endless roar of spice and cloth markets. Marco's eyes weren't only on the stalls. He watched the scale weights, the tax clerk's ledger, the way merchants greeted one another. "Trade," he said, "moves on trust, not goods." In a single day, you could hear a Latin prayer, then, 2 streets later, an Arabic bargaining chant. As geography changed, rules changed with it. Soon we crossed to Ayas in Cilician Armenia. Here, the sea fell behind us, and the caravan began. You woke to the metronome of camel bells in a courtyard inn. Loads were tied one by one, rolls of silk, glassware, coral, small gifts, a few medicinal salves, spare rope, spare saddle straps. Niccolo explained that a badly tied load wasn't an accident. It was a cost. If one camel went down, the chain reaction could break the entire line. On the road, a knot could matter as much as diplomacy. At the customs gate in Ayas, you saw the road's true face for the first time. The official checked the marks struck onto the crates. Where is this bound? Who issued this seal? Our interpreter layered each sentence through languages. When you grew impatient, Marco leaned close. Speed here isn't money. Speed is knowing the right person. A caravan isn't only camels and cargo. It's papers, relationships, and patience. The tourist passes were our first test. The road narrowed, the wind sharpened. Guides whispered where bandits came down, which bridge collapsed after rain. At times, walking turned silent, because in a tight gorge, a single echo can call danger. We spent the night in a caravanserai, thick walls, a single gate, a well in the center. As you waited in line at the well, Marco stepped in and said, "You'll forget cities, but if you forget water, the road won't forgive you." In that courtyard, in different languages, everyone spoke the same essentials: bread, water, safety. As we crossed Anatolia, even money changed shape. In one inn you bought food with copper. Days later, another demanded silver. In one town, bread was topped with sesame. In another, you survived on dried meat. For you, these were small details. For Marco, they were markers for the notebook. A road map, he said, isn't only mountains and rivers. It's prices, taxes, and units of measure. When we climbed onto the Iranian plateau, the landscape simplified and life grew harder. Days took on a single color: earth, stone, sky. In Tabriz, the market brought sound back: carpets whose patterns felt like geography, telling mountains and valleys, motif by motif. Watching Marco write, you noticed he didn't record things as beautiful. He recorded tolls, price differences, how many guards stood at which gate. Because a small delay on the road becomes a large loss 1,000 kilometers later, and he added a hard truth. Taxes exist everywhere. The difference is how they're taken. Near Yazd, architecture changed. Mud brick walls leaned together to block the sun. Wind catchers, bad gears, pulled cool air into houses. You were stunned by kunats, underground water channels running for hundreds of meters beneath the desert. A local master described how they calculated the slope with thread-thin precision. Marco whispered, "Here, civilization is measured not by swords, but by water." In Kerman, we met sickness. Dust burned your throat. Air scorched by day and froze by night. When an older man in the caravan spiked a fever, every face tightened, because a caravan slows at the weakest link. For the first time, you understood that endurance isn't bravery, it's preparation. A water skin, salt, dried food, basic remedies, spare rope. And above all, rhythm. Rise before dawn, seek shade when the sun is high, camp before the evening wind collapses. At last, we descended to Hormuz. The port looked like a summary of the world: Indian cotton, African ivory, Iranian horses, Arab sailors. Everyone spoke of the monsoon. Captains warned, sail in the wrong month, and you'll be stranded on another coast for months. Hulls were crusted with salt. Holds were deep. The winds were merciless. Niccolo made the call. This sea is a gamble this season. So we prepared to return to land. That evening on the shore, Marco turned to you. Now the real road begins. What looks like a line on a map is thirst, wind, and patience in real life. And you understood? What you'd mistaken for adventure leaving Venice was actually a long lesson taught by geography itself. And on the first page it read, "Anyone can move forward, but the one who learns is the one who records the details." Chapter 2, The Pamir's Breath, the Silence of the Gobe. When we abandoned the sea at Hormuz, the route hardened again. The coastal wind vanished. The dry breath of the interior hit our faces. As Niccolo reassembled the caravan, he told you, the sea takes in one stroke. The land wears you down slowly. Within the first week, you understood. No matter how carefully you carried your water skin, it grew lighter each day. As the days stretched, your shoulders grew heavier. The further east we went, the more thresholds we crossed. Every pass was a checkpoint. In a small town, an official would demand papers for the Khan's road. At a bridge, someone might count our camels and make us wait for hours just to write the number down. Marco didn't lose his temper. He watched instead. which goods moved most, which merchant passed faster, who owed whom. The road, he said, reveals the debts people carry between each other. As the mountains rose toward Badakhshan, the stone turned severe and the air sharpened. We learned the region yielded red stones and shining balas, rubies, precious, because they could travel straight into palace gifts. In a village, you watched craftsmen sort the rock. The brightest vein set aside, the rest sold cheaper, still valuable. On this road, nothing is truly ordinary. Everything changes meaning in the next city. In Badakhshan, Marco fell ill. Fever held for days. While the caravan sheltered in a valley, you sat by the fire on night watch, listening to his breathing. Local healers boiled herbs, rubbed oil into his chest, moistened his lips with salted water. When he gathered strength, he looked at you and said, hoarse and quiet, "These mountains, they break the pride inside a man." You learned then that moving forward sometimes begins with knowing how to stop. Then we climbed into the Pamirs. What looks like mountains on a map is, in reality, a stone sea close to the sky. Breath thins. It's as if there isn't enough air. Nights are bitter, and there's almost no fuel to burn. Even the camels quiet. Down. The bells sound dull. The water is ice-cold, metallic. One morning, a guide pointed to a bare ridge. Storms dropped there. By midday, the wind snapped sharp. Not sand, but a freezing dust that cut your face. As you wrapped cloth around your head, Marco's words stayed in your ear. Up here, the enemy is often the land itself. When we descended from the heights, the world suddenly came alive. Kashgar. More than a city, it was a knot where caravans tied together. In the bazaar, you heard Turkish, Persian, Mongolian, and Chinese in the same breath. Everyone carried measures, the weight of silk, the scent of spices, the teeth of a horse, the thickness of leather. Marco studied the scale weights closely. A small trick in one market becomes a large loss down the road. From Kashgar, we skirted the edge of the Taklamakan, advancing from oasis to oasis, rather than cutting through the heart. In Yarkand, there were orchards and canals. A day later, only sand and wind again. In Khotan, you encountered jade, smooth river stones that carried in China the meaning of respect and imperial gift. In the oases, life was organized by water. The first question at an inn wasn't how many people, but how many water skins. At night, guides found direction in the stars. By day, they read the wind's handwriting in sand. Until you learned every flat horizon looked the same. Once you learned, every small ridge became a signal. Entering the Gansu corridor, you saw the empire's spine. Watchtowers, records it passes, regular stations. The Mongol postal network, YAM, worked before your eyes. Fresh horses waited at each stop. When the officials saw the metal token, questions shortened and gates opened. Niccolo's paisa functioned like a key. When you watched a message travel hundreds of kilometers in days, you thought of how slow news moved in the West. Marco wrote, "If news is fast, governance is fast." You understood. This network wasn't only for envoys, but for taxes and orders. Near Dunhuang, we paused at caves carved into rock. Painted walls that reminded you the caravan road carried faith as much as goods. Merchants walked it, monks walked it, soldiers walked it. And then the Gobi began. In the Gobi, night is emptiness so deep, even sound feels lost. Sometimes the wind moaned so strangely you thought you heard whispers. Guides spoke of the desert, calling the lost. Marco remained steady. The desert enlarges what you carry inside. If you have fear, you'll hear fear. Months later, approaching Chengdu, you felt great order for the first time. Hunting grounds, patrols, guards of many peoples. Entering the court felt less like theater and more like a machine. Scribes writing, interpreters layering language, gifts unsealed in sequence. The Khan's gaze was sharp and curious. You realized then we were no longer just travelers. We had entered an empire's attention. When they handed us the paisa on our way out, it wasn't merely permission. It was a new identity. Marco leaned close and said one sentence. Now we're inside China. And that night in the courtyard, you felt it clearly. The road was no longer carrying us. We were carrying the road. Chapter 3. Order in Khanbalik. Flow in Hangzhou. After Chengdu, the rhythm of travel changed. The caravan's survival discipline gave way to the court's discipline of record and control. You weren't merely moving anymore. You were observing, comparing, documenting. Because in Kublai Khan's world, power begins not with the sword, but with the ledger. The day we neared Khanbalik, Dadu, you were struck by its plan. Broad avenues, organized districts, gates with watch, the sense the city hadn't grown so much as been drawn. Inside, even the crowd had direction. Marco said, "This isn't only a capital, it's the empire's management engine." In the palace, clerks wrote in multiple languages, interpreters stacked one sentence into many. In the same courtyard, you could see a Tibetan monk, a Persian merchant, a Mongol officer waiting side by side. Diversity here wasn't decoration, it was raw material for governance. The sharpest shock was money. In the market, people used paper issued by the state rather than metal coin. A roll of silk, a sack of rice, a horse. Each could change hands through a thin sheet of stamped paper. At first, you felt suspicion. Then you understood. It wasn't believing in paper. It was believing in authority. Marco leaned in. In the West, value sits inside the metal. Here, value sits behind the seal. One day they brought us to an office where the paper currency was prepared. Inside were bales of thick, fibrous paper, carved blocks for printing, serial marks along the edges. Officials counted bundles, pressed seals, wrote everything into registers. Fear of forgery was constant, so inspections were frequent and punishments harsh. Standing at those tables, you felt it. Money here was not only a tool of exchange, it was a binding cord held by the state. When everyone used the same paper, everyone was tied into the same system. Then the roads, especially the Mongol postal network, the YAM. It truly functioned like a web. Distances calculated, horses ready, provisions and lodging standardized. Show the paisa and questions shrank. Doors opened. At each station, an official recorded arrivals, wrote how many horses were issued, and sent notice forward. Marco wrote, "If news is fast, governance is fast." You could see it. The web served not only envoys, but taxation and command. A task took us down to the Grand Canal, and you saw the empire's stomach, grain barges in long lines, warehouses stretching like a horizon. The northern capital's winter survival depended on summer entries written correctly here. Along the canal, officials weighed loads, stamped, registered. In places where the water ran shallow, boats were hauled by rope from the banks. At locks, gates opened and closed with measured precision. This movement felt less like one city's trade and more like a continent's feeding plan. As we moved south, the climate softened and the cities changed voice. Arriving in Hangzhou, Quinsai, and Marco's account, You found a network of waterways and bridges that laced the city together. Markets did not shut down at night. Tea houses, silk dye shops, bakeries, paper makers, incense sellers. You watched the crowd move like a river. Wealth here wasn't weight of stone, it was density of motion. The miracle, Marco said, is how all these people can function at once. At night, you heard drums, signals for fire watch, water barrels waited at corners. Everyone knew the routine. Inside workshops, you saw production as a rhythm. Silk weavers pulling thread in measured patterns, streets lined with fine ceramics and porcelain, kilns breathing heat into the air. In a tea house, someone placed a small bowl in your hand. The taste light, the effect lingering. Marco said, "This city doesn't only consume, it produces, and production is governed through records. Every shop had a tax line, every good a unit measure, every market a supervisor. In Hangzhou, you learned how salt becomes power. Salt production moved through stamped sacks. Without the stamp, there was no sale. Tax was collected before the salt even reached the market. Something you'd known only as a table seasoning revealed itself as imperial revenue." Marco wrote, "Who controls salt controls the market." That same season, you also saw black stone that burned coal. Great cities could keep growing without devouring forests. Even that detail helped explain the scale. Religious life was as layered as commerce. Incense in temples, silence in monasteries, a different order in Muslim quarters. Yet even freedom here had an administrative shape. The state recognized groups, registered them, knew their leaders. Marco's documentary instinct appeared here most clearly. If you don't write how it works, you only admire it. You don't understand it. Returning to Khan Balak at night, patrols and timed gates reminded you again. This order had a price. The harshness unsettled you, but it also explained why the crowd didn't overflow. Marco closed his notebook and told you, "When we return, they won't believe us. Details are our insurance." Chapter 4. Monsoon, Ocean, and the Quiet of Coming Home. Over the years in the Khan's realm, you learned something. Empires expand not only by conquest, but by marriage. One day, in Kublai Khan's presence, we received an assignment: escort a princess by sea to the Iranian lands for a dynastic union. It sounded official, but its meaning was simple. We were going out onto the open ocean, and we weren't carrying only ourselves, we were carrying the Khan's honor. Even preparation was a festival of documentation. Every crate's contents were written down, gift lists compiled, seals checked and rechecked. A missing piece of silk wouldn't count as lost. It would count as insult. At the great southern port, you saw sailors from many worlds: Arabs, Persians, Indians, Chinese. Warehouses held porcelain in latticed crates, bales of silk, sacks of ginger and pepper. Customs officers weighed and stamped, then wrote everything into ledgers. Everyone talked about wind, because here the calendar is written in monsoon seasons. The ships were unlike those you'd known in the Mediterranean. Broad hulls, deep holds, internal compartments so one breach wouldn't flood the whole body. Multiple masts, segmented sails, able to catch wind from varied angles. At the stern, heavy steering that turned the ship slowly and surely. A captain told you, "This ship is heavy, but on the ocean, heavy is good." The moment you stepped onto deck, dust gave way to salt. Ropes cut your hands. The sun burned differently. Discipline at sea isn't like discipline on land. Everything is ration and schedule. Water barrels are numbered, rice and dried legumes kept from damp. Salted fish and dried meat distributed by turn, Watches are strict. At night, one man scans the horizon while another checks lines and knots. Soon you understand. If the system breaks, the sea turns the error into punishment immediately. We took a few coastal stops, breathing along the shore. In the ports of Champa, the air was warm and wet, the markets full of rice, fish, coconuts. Then the open sea began. On one storm night, clinging to a mast, you felt for the first time what it meant for the ground to vanish beneath you. On land, if you fall, there is earth. At sea, if you fall, your story ends. In the dark, Marco turned and said only this. In the Pamirs, air was missing. Here, the ground is missing. Then the monsoon forced us to stop. We sheltered near Sumatra and waited for months. Waiting, the heaviest part of travel. Humidity rotted things, food spoiled, insects never ended, sickness threatened the ship. Some men's gums bled, others couldn't rise for days. You realize seasickness is often long journey sickness. The princess's safety required constant vigilance because we carried a political trust. Even during the waiting, Marco recorded the day the wind shifted, the day prices rose, how many fell ill. Seeing the notes, you understood. Progress isn't only movement. It's keeping order while you cannot move. When the wind turned, we pushed into the Indian Ocean. The sea grew, the sky grew. Near Sri Lanka, currents were measured constantly. On the Malabar coast, you saw the heart of spice trade. A sack of pepper could rival silver. Bargaining in the harbor felt as serious as prayer. Merchants of different faiths met at the same scales. Once again, trust proved more valuable than money. Marco didn't chase exotic stories. He chased measures. Which unit of weight, where the tax was taken, which port turned which goods fastest. At last, we reached Hormuz. Delivering the princess wasn't like unloading cargo. It was like preventing a crisis. Papers were checked, seals compared, witnesses recorded. When the task ended, the caravan reformed and we began the land return westward. The Iranian plateau was more familiar this time, but your eyes had changed. The same market, the same road, the same inn, none of them were the places you'd seen years before. And then Venice. The lagoons smelled the same, but you weren't the same. People listened with raised brows. Konbalik, paper money, coal, as if hunting for exaggeration. Marco's notebooks, your memory, Nicolo's documents, each stood like evidence. Still, doubt clung easily. There's a Venetian tale that the Polos, when no one believed them, ripped open the seams of their worn clothes and poured out the jewels they'd hidden inside. I don't know if it's true, but it captures the hunger for proof. Not long after, war and captivity followed. Marco was taken prisoner in a sea battle. In prison, he began telling our journey to another man, and words became the road's new vehicle. The cold of the Pamirs, the silence of the Gobi, the order of Konbalik, the flow of Hangzhou, rebuilt through detail. You understood then. We crossed continents. But the hardest part was returning home and convincing people that the real was real. That's why Marco wrote down every bridge, every tax ledger, every market scale. Now I'll ask you, if you had been there, in which moment would you have changed the most? Counting water in the desert? Searching for breath in the Pamirs? Feeling the ground disappear at sea? Or returning home to a world that didn't believe you? If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Leave a comment about which region impacted you most. Let's bring the next part to life together.